Well, Setcho Dolma, thank you, and thank you, Tibetan community, for your welcome. I'm just getting rigged up here. It's actually a tape that I listen to, and then I can give my talk from it. What I take from your story of your family on Tibet is the destruction of an ancient and laudable culture in harmony with the land by outsiders to make money. And you ask, why is this happening? And it's because not just China, but the whole world is currently overtaken by materialism, a religion of getting more money. And it's devoid of the other values that we human beings have so often in so many cultures had, which were based on a reverence for the land, for this little planet Earth. That's all we've got. And it can do without us, and did for a long time, but we can't do without it. But at the moment, it's rape and pillage of the planet to make money. And there was a culture in Beijing from the late 1940s, after the great march or trek or walk, which was egalitarianism, communism giving equality to all the people. But that has been trashed itself. And these days, where you see the word communist in terms of the Chinese Communist government, knock it out. It's a plutocracy, which means a government by the rich. And suddenly, there are more billionaires in Beijing than there are in New York. And every one of those billionaires is an affiliate of the Communist Party. You can't function in Beijing if you're not an affiliate of the Communist Party. And Setcho's talk is about the impending and ongoing destruction of the natural face of Tibet, but at the end, a threat to the whole world from this out-of-hand rush to exploit this planet in a way it can't stand. And so, as we're sitting here tonight, we human beings, this herd of mammals of 8 billion, the biggest herd of mammals, that's us human beings, ever on the face of the planet, is grazing it at 160% of its ability to replace. We're using the living environment 60% faster than it can replace itself. So every day there's less fisheries, there's less forests, there's less biodiversity, species of animals, there's less arable land, there's more mouths to feed, and we can all see what the result will be. But in Tibet, this beautiful third pole of the world, there's the North Pole, the South Pole, and then there's the Tibetan Plateau sitting up there above 4,000 metres with how many glaciers? 36,000 glaciers, 95% of which are melting rapidly due to the earth heating up, due to us burning oil, coal and gas largely, and that compounding a situation which can be put very simply. Downstream of that plateau and its 8 or 12 great rivers are 1 billion people plus dependent on that water. And forever, as far as we human beings are concerned, that water kept coming down the rivers because the glaciers in the wet season got bigger and in the dry season melted and the water went down the rivers. We're getting to the point where more and more of those rivers will have no glaciers. Now think that through. It means that when the dry season comes, there will be no water going down the rivers. And it means that the people down there on the plains, that billion plus people in China and India and Vietnam and elsewhere, won't be getting water from the big tank, the Tibetan Plateau. And yet, as if these rivers aren't their lifeblood, the bureaucrats, the plutocrats in Beijing are damming them at an extraordinary rate for what Situ call clean power. The Tasmanian Hydroelectric Commission calls it clean power too. But you know what? Those dams, and they're being built now, they're huge dams, bigger than the Tasmanian dams by a long shot. They're being completed at the rate of one a fortnight. There's 360 on the drawing board. They're producing hydroelectricity by flooding back along the valleys, and where they do, everything dies. It's clean power killing the ecosystems behind those dams. And it's used as an argument widely, and we have it in this country, that hydroelectricity is at least clean power, it's renewable energy in an age of global warming. Well, really? Where you have a dam that floods back over forests and peatlands, that rots behind the dam. And if you go down to Lake Pedder in Tasmania and stand by the shore, lots of people say, "Bob, what are those bubbles? Because is there a platypus there? The bubbles keep coming up." This is 30, 40, 50 years after that dam was put in. No, those bubbles are methane. And methane is 20 times more potent than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas warming up the planet. That's the rotting vegetation underneath coming to the... And there's been Chinese studies as well as Brazilian studies on this, they don't put them out there, are actually bringing a potent greenhouse gas behind those hydro dams into the atmosphere and adding to the burden of climate change as they go. You will know a lot about the pillage of the Tibetan Plateau and the nomadic people on Tibet. One of the things that is so cruel about the propaganda system coming out of Beijing is that somehow the nomadic people of Tibet were a problem for climate change. They were grazing their yaks and their other animals, sheep, on the various parts of the plateau and eating the grass. And what they're doing, the Chinese say, is creating these big national parks in the headwaters of these rivers so the grass can grow, and as it grows, it takes back carbon dioxide and methane out of the atmosphere. Well, the Tibetan herdspeople have been there as far back as 9,000 years ago. And before them, there were big herds, and with them, big herds of antelope and asses and yaks and other wildlife. Eating the grass, it came and it went, as the seasons came and went. And I've been reading the literature in the last couple of days about this. I cannot understand how it can be that if you remove those animals and let the grass grow, you're going to get any future benefit over that. It will become immediately a steady state, as far as with the grass getting shorter in the bad season, getting longer in the good season. Nature is a steady state as far as global warming is concerned. And the idea that the herdspeople, the nomadic people on the Tibetan Plateau are the problem is purely manufactured. It's as manufactured as the book a Chinese ambassador gave me when I became a senator in Canberra. And when you went to the back page of this book, it had the simple statement that the Tibetan people were not very smart because they lived at such a high altitude, there wasn't much oxygen there, and therefore your brain couldn't work very well. And I thought, well, no, the Tibetan people, if this absurd statement was true, the Tibetan people have been there for thousands of years and have accommodated. The problem is with the Han Chinese who have come up there who are not used to it. They're not getting the oxygen. They don't see what is good for Tibet. As an Australian, I am ashamed that our politicians and our business people tug their forelock to this billionaire coterie, this plutocracy in Beijing that shredded its own ethic to feather its own nest and become such a massive force around the planet for making more money. You won't hear our Foreign Minister or our Prime Minister, and it doesn't matter whether it's Labor or Liberal, speaking up about the environmental destruction of Tibet, and the mining simply adds to it, nor about the infringement of human rights. And did you know, I think most of you will know, that so distressing is the situation there that over 150 Tibetans have immolated, that is, burnt themselves to death in protest in less than the last decade. If that was happening in any other country, there would be massive anguish about it. But it's in Tibet, and it's uncomfortable for our politicians and our business people to speak to these usurpers of human rights and dignity and fairness in Beijing. And I've been at an environmental conference where we've moved in the past a motion about the situation in Tibet, the environmental situation in Tibet. And I found that with the delegates from Beijing at that conference, you couldn't have a discussion. They simply came full-on angry. You must withdraw this motion. You don't know. What about your Aboriginal people? A full-on attack on the person. No discussion about the issue because they cannot sustain a reasonable debate on the issue of the environmental destruction, the cultural destruction, and the theft of the Tibetan High Plateau from the people it belonged to for time immemorial. And it's that anger that I think gets in the way very often of our own politicians and business people saying, well, if that's the way you feel, you can leave. I'm not going to be bullied by you. But instead of that, we have people backing off. And of course, there's money at stake. There's trade at stake. You would think Australia's the wealthiest country on the face of the planet. We're the wealthiest people ever to have existed in terms of dollars per capita. And yet we so often fail to stand up when we should in global arenas for the people and the environment that's having wrong done by it. It's a great pleasure to be here with such a grounded, knowledgeable visitor all the way from New York. With that experience and that little straw hat, that cowboy hat as you called it, sitting there in that group on the Tibetan plateau and understanding how important and how beautiful that life has been on the Tibetan plateau, but not quite understanding why it is it's being so destroyed with the world turning its back on the destroyers. It's all about greed, ladies and gentlemen. It's all about a greedy culture in Beijing, but it's elsewhere around the world, which puts human fairness second to the making of money and the abuse of power. Well, there are people speaking up about it. It was my pleasure to talk about this when I was in the Senate. In fact, in my first speech, I was talking about Tibet when I got cut off by the Speaker of the Senate because my time was up. And I noticed that after that, not one senator was ever cut off because her or his speech's time was up. But they didn't want me talking about Tibet. Well, I got to talk about Tibet, of course, went to Tibet. I can't go to China. It's another part of this Chinese power play. Speak up honestly about what is happening in Tibet or about democracy in China, and you'll be banned from going to the country. That's because there's an intellectual cowardice in Beijing, hardly paralleled elsewhere in the world, which says we won't have you confronting our problems. We'll confront yours, fine, but you mustn't confront ours. Well, one of these days, the leadership in Beijing will either grow up or be replaced. And when it is, the world will be ashamed about turning its back on Tibet, but very glad that there are people keeping that culture and that love of land and that reverence for the environment alive and well. It's miserable times at the moment, but better times will come. And the day will come when Tibet will have the sun shining on its culture and its people once again. Thanks, everybody.